Hey guys, today we're going to be going over if the SAT/ACT really matters. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of schools have basically phased out the SAT/ACT or made themselves test optional, so students don't even have to submit tests to still be competitive for admission. So the question is, should you even spend effort preparing for these tests? And when should you even submit your scores? Because obviously you can go test optional now. The short answer is it depends. So let's take a look at a few pretty prestigious universities and their approach to the SAT. First of all, we'll take a look at the UCs, so the University of California schools, the two most prestigious of those being the UC Berkeley and UCLA. So UCs no longer consider SAT/ACT scores. So you can submit your SAT or ACT, but it doesn't matter if you got a 1600 or a 500 on the SAT, that's not going to change your probability of admission. Now, let's take a look at Cornell. And again, the same thing here. 3 of Cornell's colleges no longer use the SAT. So if you're applying for any of these colleges, especially like the College of Business, you don't need to submit your test scores because they're not going to use it to decide if you're admitted or not. And finally, with Harvard, you can submit your SAT scores and they can help you, but they're also not mandatory. So how do colleges actually use standardized tests to decide admission, at least for the ones that do, seeing as some of them have stopped doing so? Well, looking at the info from the Harvard lawsuit, it seems that Harvard uses the SAT here in order to determine your academic rating. So this is just one of the things they use. A higher academic rating obviously means a higher chance of admission. So you can see here, if you have an academic rating of 2, that means you have a mid to high 700 SAT scores or above 300 on the ACT. And then again, the lower the academic rating, the lower your SAT/ACT scores, right? So this is what you should be aiming for if you're trying to get a 2 on the academic rating in Harvard. And if you have above this on the SAT, I wouldn't really recommend you take it. Same thing for the ACT, or I wouldn't recommend you retake it. How does MIT then use the SAT? Because MIT, maybe you guys don't know, but is actually now test mandatory. It was one of the first very, very high-ranked schools to basically force students to start submitting the SAT again, and it's no longer a test optional school. Well, according to this former MIT Dean of Admissions, seems like the SAT math score is the best available tool to distinguish between students who would succeed and those who would not. So people who are getting 800 on the SAT math, people who are getting very high on the SAT math section, they're much more likely to succeed at MIT and not drop out compared to students who are getting lower scores. And MIT actually focuses a lot on the SAT. So what score should you aim for, right? Because I've talked about Harvard, but there's many other universities. So what score should you aim for all these different universities? And how much do they really care about the SAT? Well, here I've created just a quick ranking, right? From the schools on the left side, don't use standardized tests at all, while the schools on the right side heavily use standardized tests. So we'll take a look here, right? These schools, UC Berkeley, UCLA, Caltech, they don't use the SAT whatsoever, SAT or ACT. If you have a good score, if you have a bad score, it doesn't really matter. And you shouldn't even submit your scores to these schools unless you need it for some other reason, like, I don't know, skipping a course or something like that. Next, the University of Chicago and Cornell University. Obviously, we just talked about Cornell, but U Chicago is one of those schools where it's kind of known for being one of those quirky schools. They care a lot about your personality, and the standardized test scores are not very important. U Chicago is a test optional school, so that means you don't need to submit your scores. And if you have good scores, it'll help you. But if you have bad scores, it's not going to be something that they're just going to auto-deny you, unlike some of the schools further on this list. Next, Columbia and Yale. So these schools care a decent amount about the SAT, but they care about more things like the GPA and your class rank a lot more. So you shouldn't really focus too much on trying to get a good SAT/ACT score for these schools, and they care a lot more about things like class rank. Next, you have the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard University. Schools like these two schools, they are also test optional, just like all these schools here. At least out of these 8 schools, all of them are test optional. But as you saw, for example, in the Harvard lawsuit documents, or just from some of the other things you can find on the web about University of Pennsylvania, these schools do care a decent amount about the SAT, and having a good score can help you get admitted. Now, that's not to say that you can't get admitted if you don't have a good SAT, and we'll look a bit at that later, but it just goes to say that the SAT can actually help you a decent amount, and these schools care about the SAT a little bit more than, for example, Columbia and Yale. And now these schools, right? These schools are where the SAT is the most important, and MIT is the one where it's the most important. These schools really, well, at a place like Harvard or the University of Pennsylvania, as 1,500 plus, that's a pretty good score. You should submit that. At a school like MIT, they're really, really focused on their math curriculum, and same thing for CMU. These schools are expecting students to be able to easily achieve scores of 790 or 800 on the SAT math section, because if you're not able to do that, chances are you're going to struggle to do well in those schools, and you have a much higher dropout rate. And this is backed up by data from MIT. So for these schools, if you're applying, English section doesn't matter that much. You can scrape by a 700 plus on the English, maybe even 690, but you definitely want to be submitting at least a 790 or an 800, very high math score to these schools. Because if you're not able to easily get a really high math score, they're unlikely to admit you. So now, just for all the schools that are still test optional, though, should you go test optional? Let's take a look at the common data set, which is basically a document that every university in the US publishes every year. And it has some of these statistics, such as like SAT and ACT statistics. So let's take a look. Out of all the students who were enrolled in fall 2022, these are all the first year students. So everyone who basically got into Harvard and they actually matriculated at Harvard. 55% of people submitted an SAT score, and 28% of people submitted an ACT score. So that means at least 17% of admitted students did not submit scores, and it's most likely higher than that, as we'll see soon. This is because people can submit both an SAT and an ACT score, so you can have double counting here. Someone who submitted SAT and ACT would add 1 to both of these numbers, even though they're still just one person. But we know at least 17% of admitted students did not submit scores. So it goes to show definitely you have a good chance of getting into Harvard, even if you don't submit a SAT. Now, let's take a look at a pre-COVID time. So when tests were still mandatory for schools like Harvard. You had, like you can see here, 71% people submit an SAT and 45% of people submit an ACT. So you can see the double counting here is pretty obvious. And these are the scores. So most people on between the 25th and 75th percentile had between 750 and 800 on the SAT math, 710 to 770 on SAT English, and all of these things for the ACT. And this kind of goes in line with the previous admissions guidelines, if you guys still remember those, where you're trying to get at least around a 750 on both sections of the SAT and a 33 plus on the ACT composite, which you can see right here, because that gives you an academic rating of 2. This is very similar for most Ivy League schools. Schools like Dartmouth or maybe Cornell, since those are a bit easier to get into, it might be lower. So maybe if you're trying to get a 750 for Harvard, you only need a 730. But you should be aiming for at least around a 750 on the math and English section to be competitive for these schools, which are test optional. And if you have below that, it's not really recommended that you submit your tests, especially if you have a good GPA. We'll go into if you should submit your tests if you have a bad GPA in a bit. And we can just take a look at some more statistics. So this one isn't too relevant because most people took their SATs before COVID really started hitting. These 2020 to 2021 stats are very similar to the stats from 2019 to 2020. Not really a big change here. But as soon as we get here to 2021 to 2022, you see the amount of people submitting is much lower. These two numbers don't up to 100%. So you know that students are getting admitted for sure. Around 15% of students got admitted without submitting any scores. And this is because these universities, if you don't submit a score, they can still give you something like a 2 on the academic rating if you saw in Harvard. That's because they know a lot of students weren't able to access testing centers because of the COVID-19 pandemic, etc., etc. But let's go a bit further into 2022 to 2023, where, COVID was a bit less. It's a less big of an issue. You still see the same thing where less people are submitting their scores, but people who aren't submitting their scores are still able to have a pretty good shot of getting into the school. Additionally, all of these things, so the medians, percentiles, etc., it's pretty similar. You see exactly here, AC composite is around 33. And that's not a coincidence right there. That's because if you're getting a 33 plus on the ACT, that's going to really bump up your chance of admission, because that would move you to a 2 in the academic rating instead of, for example, a 3. And even though less people are submitting scores, people are still submitting around the same average of scores. So people are still submitting around a 1550 average for the SAT, 33 average or 34 average here for the ACT, etc., etc. But you can see here, even though there is more access to testing centers, Harvard and these other Ivies, they still are okay with you not submitting scores. So here's a general rule of thumb then. Basically, if you have a 1500 plus, you should submit your scores. You should almost always submit if you have 1500 plus, because that means you would be around at least the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile for SAT math, and you would be the same thing for SAT English. Unfortunately, I took the SAT. I don't have too much knowledge on the ACT, but I would say if you have a 33 plus on the ACT, you should submit your ACT score, because this is what's going to get you into the academic rating of 2 on Harvard's rating scale. Now, if you have 1400 to 1500, you should sometimes submit. So here it kind of really depends. If you're, for example, your socioeconomic background's a bit lower than the applicant, and you're getting like a 1480, it's okay to submit, because these universities also take into account, for example, if you are able to, if you're working a job, you have a lot of extracurriculars, you're very busy, don't have that much time to study for the SAT, and let's say you got like a 1480, you can still submit that, and it's most likely not going to harm your chances. But if you are someone who's coming from a very wealthy background, you have not really many extracurriculars, you're not busy working, you shouldn't really submit a 1400 to 1500 on the SAT, because if I'm a admissions officer, for example, that's just going to be, hey, that's a bit weird. They're 100 points lower than another student who might have even been busy with work, they might have been busy with extracurriculars, and the score's just a bit low. So you should go test optional in some cases here if you have around this range, and go submit your test if you have other conditions. Now, if you have less than 1400, you should almost never submit your SAT score. If there were severe extenuating circumstances and you can explain them, you can submit your SAT. It won't really matter that much, but you really shouldn't submit, because it's not really going to help your application. And if you have this score and you still have a very good GPA, like a 4.0 unweighted GPA, they're just going to still give you an academic rating of 2 based on your GPA and your class rank or something like that, the course rigor, etc., etc. And this SAT score can only harm you. And if you're applying to schools that don't use the SAT, obviously, just don't submit. It's a huge waste of money, and you can submit your SATs at any time. So if you really need your SATs for something like being able to skip a course at the UCs, you can always submit later. It takes 5 days for the college board to transfer the scores over. It's not a big deal. So just don't waste your money and submit scores, the SAT scores, to schools that don't use it, or to even schools that allow self-reporting, which I'm not sure how many there are in the US, but for example, Oxford or Cambridge in the UK, you can just self-report. You don't need to waste your money on submitting. Now, this is the biggest and I think the most important point, actually. And even though I know this entire video has really been focused on SATs, I think the most important thing to actually talk about here is GPA. Because a good GPA can counter a bad SAT score, but a good SAT score cannot counter a bad GPA. This means basically, if you have a 1600 on the SAT, but you basically still have a 3.0 GPA, your good SAT score isn't going to counter your bad GPA. And this is because GPA is something that's taken over a long period of time. And if you're not able to succeed well academically, if there's extenuating circumstances, it's a bit different. But for the average student, if you're not able to succeed well academically on a normal basis, and sure, you were able to do good on the SAT, A lot of the time it goes to show things like, hey, maybe they could have just gone a tutor, or they might be good at studying for this one test, but they're not really a committed student. They won't be ready to handle the academic rigor that's being held at our schools like Harvard or Yale. And it basically, it won't counter a good SAT score of 1600, won't be able to make up for getting a low GPA. So if you have the option, for example, of studying for another 2 hours, and you'll be able to bump up your SAT from 1500 to 1600, versus in that 2 hours, your GPA will change from a 4.0 to, like, for example, a 3.8. You should almost always focus on your GPA first. Your SAT is not very important, and with test optional becoming bigger and bigger, I would highly suggest that students aim to focus on their GPA first, SAT second. And a second thing, again, here with this first point, if you have a low SAT, just go test optional. And the schools are still going to rate you very high academically if you're able to have a good class rank, if you're able to have a good GPA, and if you're able to have things like good teacher recommendations that say you're like a really academically strong student, etc., etc. All right, so to everyone applying, good luck. To all those people who are taking the SAT, good luck to you as well. I hope you guys learned something from this video, and yeah, hopefully you guys all get in.